Thanks for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast. If you like what you hear today, be sure to subscribe to it, follow it, rate it, review, and share with everyone you know. You can also follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook for regular updates about future episodes. Today, we're brought to you by Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram at Chicopee. Stop by their state-of-the-art dealership between BJ's and Big Y on Memorial Drive, or check out MetroJeep.com and drive home in your new Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram today. Now, here's today's episode with music journalist Dan Epstein on Baxie's Musical Podcast.
What is it?
It's Baxie's Musical Podcast.
Resistance is useless.
Last September, I recorded an interview with Stephen McDonald from the band Red Kross. Perhaps you remember it, perhaps you don't. If you don't, maybe now would be a good time to listen to it and try to catch up. Red Kross is a band that was started by Stephen McDonald and his older brother Jeff in 1978 when they were both 11 and 13 years old. They've since gone on to become what has been described as the most important band in America. How they got to that point is maybe one of the most amazing and inconceivable stories in music history. Despite periods of self-sabotage, drug use, a kidnapping, several long sabbaticals, and wildly abrupt changes in musical direction, Red Kross holds an important place in American music history. They've influenced punk, glam, psychedelia, grunge, and power pop, unapologetically, and even from a place of relative obscurity. How can you have it both ways? Well, that's part of the story of Red Kross. Admittedly, I came to the band rather late in the game, but once I dove in, I couldn't help but feel as though I had wasted part of my life for not jumping in sooner, like much sooner. And I could kick myself for sleeping on these guys in spite of being aware of them since the mid-1980s. How I missed this, I will never know, but now I'm here, and now I'm hooked. Oddly enough, Red Kross has been busy making some of the most gloriously wonderful music of their career. That simply doesn't happen for bands that have been around for 46 years. But that's not how the McDonald brothers operate, as they make some of the best power pop records ever recorded. That's right, you heard me, the best power pop records ever recorded, ever. 2024 was a hell of a year for Red Kross between an insanely good documentary film entitled Born Innocent by Andrew Reich, an amazing self-titled double album, better known as the Red Album, and the richly entertaining biography entitled Now You're One of Us. This was the year to discover the most important band in America. The author of that book was journalist Dan Epstein. Dan has written extensively for Rolling Stone, the LA Times, USA Today, Spin Magazine, Guitar World, and dozens of other publications. He's contributed to a number of different projects about music, including his own excellent music Substack called Jagged Time Lapse. He's also authored two great books about baseball in the 1970s, including the book Stars and Strikes, Baseball in America in the Bicentennial Summer of 1976, and Big Hair and Plastic Grass. But his book about Red Kross is a first for Dan Epstein, and he'll tell you more about that. Either way, it was a huge home run, which for those of you not paying attention is a cheap and gratuitous baseball reference. This is my conversation with journalist Dan Epstein on Baxie's Musical Podcast. I'm so glad to have you. This has been, I don't know, if whatever reason, it feels like the year of Red Kross, so it's good.
Oh, for many reasons.
For a lot of reasons.
We could start there. So, yeah, I mean, it really is the year of Red Kross. It's, the new album, double album, their first double album ever out of in a 40-year career, new documentary and new book. It's kind of amazing that it all sort of, and then like big tours in the US and the UK.
So I read the book back in September, and then I got the record and seen the film, and then I interviewed Stephen. And in all fairness, I didn't really know the full story going into all this, and then once I got into it, I learned the story pretty heavily. How did you get involved in writing this book, and how much of the story did you know going into this?
I would say, oh God, that's a really good question. I would say I knew 75%, 80%. It's like there were, like, I knew the basic, all the basic plot points. The story about Stephen's kidnapping, I actually did not know until I heard his podcast appearance, Turned Out a Punk podcast appearance.
Right.
And that was like well after the fact of him doing that podcast, I think. It's all blurry now. But basically, to answer your other question, how it started was, I was a big Red Cross fan going back to the late 80s. And I'd interviewed Stephen and Jeff a couple of times over the years. I was in LA for about 22 years, which coincided with their phase shifter and show world period and then their hiatus. So during show world, I think that was the first time I had interviewed them. And in the spring of 2002, Neurotica was given the 35th anniversary release by Merge, I believe it was. And so I interviewed Stephen about it for Flood Magazine. And that was a really good interview, and it just kind of set a few things in motion. A book agent I'd been working with by the name of Lee Sobel was like, hey, that was a cool interview. Do you think Stephen would want to do a book? And, my response was like, yeah, maybe, but I kind of think it's a package deal. You can't really, Stephen's had a really interesting life, but so much of his life, and we talk about that in the book, so much of his life is, being part of the Red Cross story. But what was interesting was when we started talking to them about doing the book, that was when I learned that there was a documentary in the works. Up until that moment, for whatever reason, I know it had been announced and there was a GoFundMe forever. Yeah, I was just involved with my own shit. So I guess I kind of missed the announcement. So the timing on that was really perfect because Jeff and Stephen had already been sort of in the headspace of talking about their past, talking about their careers, talking about, where things went wrong or where things went right. And Andrew Reich, who was working on the documentary, had just finished like an initial, like the first cut of it, and was very generous about sharing it with me and Lee, which really helped us, get a sense of what the book should be about or should be like, and it helped us, in the writing of the proposal for the book. But, all these other things that kind of, the Year of the Red Cross thing that we're talking about, at the time we were talking to them about doing the book, we had no idea when the documentary was going to come out. And at the time, Jeff and Stephen didn't even have an idea that they were going to do another record. So it's just all these things sort of came together over the course of the last 2 years. So it's been really, just as a fan, it's been really exciting to watch it all come together. And, as somebody who knows the story and has witnessed their kind of roller coaster ride, it's like, like this is what I've been rooting for all along, was like this, for there to be this kind of golden moment where all of a sudden, like, they're firing on all cylinders at the exact same time that people are paying attention to them. And it's been great.
It's been fun to watch and fun to read because, I'm a sucker for a good rock story, but there are very few of them that are quite like this. And
yeah,
and it's not just one story. You find that it's, one crazy story after another. And the least of which is the fact, the whole age thing. They're opening up for Black Flag in their first gig at the age of 11 and 13 years old.
15, but yeah,
whatever. My mother wouldn't have let me go out on a school night. That's unheard of.
No, it's funny because like my girlfriend's mom read the book and she's like, their parents should have been arrested. It's like, but it was the 70s and like, their parents were working full-time jobs and, when we all had a longer leash as children back then than they do today. And, we talk about it in the book. I'm sure they would have had the same impulses regardless of where they grew up. I'm sure they would have, clearly music was a major, major thing for them early on. Pop culture was a major, major thing for them early on. But just by the sheer luck of the draw, they happened to grow up 3 or 4 miles from where Black Flag were living and rehearsing.
And those Black Flag fellas seem like perfectly reasonable youths.
Well, I mean, they were, it's like, in a sense, they were like, they were outsiders, but like they treated, it wasn't like these kids were coming in and they were like forcing them to do drugs or, or run illegal errands for them. I mean, it was, they were just stoked. I mean, I think Greg Ginn was trying to build something of a scene and just thought like, kind of in the same way that Jeff was thinking, like, well, here are these kids, and this is kind of like an angle we can work, and encourage.
I had read some interviews with you that your entry point with Red Kross comes at around Neurotica. And I remember playing, a lot of those songs on college radio. You and I are almost exactly the same age. And it didn't start falling in line for me with Red Kross until years later when they started to reissue some of that back catalog. And I remember going back and listening and wondering, how the hell did I miss this? They're considered to be one of the most important band in America, but yet they've been covered in obscurity for a good portion of those 46 years. And some people would say, well, how can you have it both ways? But considering how they have influenced so many other bands, it's not obscurity. It's just, people haven't gotten to the point of discovering them yet.
Yeah. It's so much, you look at their story and so much is about timing and when, and stuff that was, obviously they did a lot of things that impeded their own progress, but there were things like, like Neurotica comes out and it's on Big Time Records, and, which is like a huge move for them at the time, but then Big Time goes bankrupt, like, weeks into Neurotica being out. And so like they're doing a major tour of the US and the record is not anywhere, it cannot be found anywhere. I mean, like my first copy of Neurotica was, I taped it off a friend of mine because I couldn't, he turned me on to it, but then I couldn't find a copy anywhere. It wasn't until like a year later I found it for $1 in a cutout bin in a record store in Providence, Rhode Island. It was just like sitting there. It was this magical day. It was sitting there along with $1 copy of the first Undertones record, like another record I'd been desperately searching for. It's like the record gods smiled upon me that day. But and I think, but because my friend had seen them on tour in '87 and turned me on to them, then, I was clued in. I was working at the college radio station. I was able to like pull out, the station had a copy of Born Innocent. It had a copy of Teen Babes. I was able to pull those out. It had a copy of the Love Dolls soundtracks. So it was like, wow, these guys are into all kinds of stuff. And like they did all kind of, I mean, we had an Anarchy 6 record at the college radio station, and which I think I taped because like I had to like have everything Red Kross had done because I was, so fanatical at that point. And I think I listened to the Anarchy 6 record exactly once, but and you talk to people who are Red Kross fans now, and like everybody kind of came in at a different point, and everybody has their own, it's like I have friends who are just like Third Eye Man. That's the record. That's where I came in on. That's what blew my mind. That's, still to this day, that's the one I go back to. And, and you've got Steven who's just like, oh my God, Third Eye. like I hate that record. And, but and then again, this is a record that in theory should have catapulted them to the big time because it was, it was a really well-produced record. It was on a major label, but it came out about a year too early for the kind of alternative revolution. And at the time when it came out, all these people who loved like the weirdness and jankiness of Neurotica were like, oh, this sounds kind of clean. This is kind of, this is kind of poppy. I don't know, and so it's you just see where it's it's amazing that they're still making music today, but it's you go back and just like every point, like there are people back from old school fans from LA who are like, Born Innocent, that's or the first EP, like that's like nothing ever topped that. And
Right.
but they've kept going and they've kept making new music that's often, you can like each record is an evolution. Each record is a differs from the last one, is a kind of step in a different direction.
You mentioned that element of self-sabotage with these
Yes.
guys. And it's the funny thing is about it when you look at the film and the book, you get a sense there's not a lot of regret involved here. They seem to be happy doing what they're doing and in spite of themselves. But one of the things that I think fans really had to be challenged by is these guys were pivoting from one thing to the next, just like you say. Neurotica does not sound like Third Eye, doesn't sound like Face Shifter, it doesn't sound like Born Innocent. I mean, it's like one giant pivot after another. But oddly enough, not every band that's been at it for 46 years gets better and better, and yet the Red Album is unbelievable. It's incredible.
I mean, I've heard some people say like, oh, it would have been better as a single album. I just think like it's an incredibly dense record. It's like there's so much. There's 18 songs on there. I mean, there's a lot to process, and I feel like, our brains, our ears, like it's not like the 70s when a double record would come out and we just like, just really absorb it and get into it all. Now it's like, 18 songs, that's a lot. I don't know that I can, digest all that. And, and it took me a while, not because I didn't think it was good, but it was just like, there's a lot of hooks on there. There's a lot of great songwriting and you just need to, but yeah, it's incredibly strong. It's amazing. Again, it's different than anything that they've ever done in the sense that it's just Jeff and Steven with Josh Klingenhofer, and that's it. And I think Jason Shapiro throws down a few guitar leads on it, but like it's in a sense the most Red Kross record ever because it is mostly Jeff and Steven, and they're sharing a lot more songwriting. They're sharing a lot more vocals. I mean, and a lot of the songs are very referential to their story, lyrically. So yeah, it's a fascinating record.
You mentioned the abduction story, and it's an incredibly disturbing relationship that Steven has here, and
right.
How it progresses and how it ends is a really powerful part of the story. When you're talking to these guys, and I don't know if it was the same challenge in the film, how open was Steven to talk about this? Because this is pretty disruptive type of psychologically damaging stuff.
Stephen was very open to talk about it. And a lot of times I felt like our interview sessions were like therapy sessions where we're like, like Third Eye, like, he's still really bugged by Third Eye. We had 3 different interviews about Third Eye because each time he'd come back, he'd like, I have more to say about it. Or like he'd come back and like, I wrote some stuff down that I want to say about it. I mean, it was like, it was bringing a lot of stuff up, which was great. And it was great for the book. And I think they'd already filmed the stuff for the movie about the abduction, this woman Dee, who was 10 years older than him and knew him and Jeff from the punk scene and kind of developed this really inappropriate relationship with him when he was only 13. And, that story in and of itself is pretty, jaw-dropping. But the thing that I really took away from it, and, we get into that in the book as well, is like so much of what happened was, directly related to this weird line that Stephen was trying to walk in his life. He was a kid, he was an adult, he was punk, he was an A student. It was like he was trying to juggle all these things. And, he wanted to be accepted in this punk scene. And this woman, was kind of like a, original LA punk scenester. So that made her very attractive in a sense. but at the same time, like he was getting beat up at school because he had like a little, bit of patch of color in his hair or stuff
Right.
like that. So I was really moved talking to him about that, with just this, like, I didn't, Stephen and I are about the same age. I didn't go through exactly the same, trials and tribulations he did, but as a kid, I felt a similar, like, tug between, like, wanting to be an adult and wanting to be more kind of accepted into an adult world. But at the same time, like, I, like Stephen, I was kind of like a rule follower. I was, somebody who, wanted to, who thought, like, by being a good guy and doing the right thing, good things will come to you. And we were both, rather rudely disabused of that notion along the way.
Isn't it funny that, guys our age, late 50s, we all grew up kind of wanting to be an adult. Then you finally get there and you say, Jesus, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah, this
is so much
sucks.
worse.
And and certainly I could relate to both of, their, music and pop culture was such a big, nutrient delivery system for them, in their younger years, as it was for me. So I felt like that was, I felt like I was, not just because I was a huge fan, but because we were coming from very similar places. And though I didn't grow up in LA, I did live in LA on and off as a kid. So, like, the reference points, like, I could see, I could see certain stretches of Hollywood Boulevard and that they were talked about in my mind. And, so I felt like we were very copacetic, and that made it a lot easier for them to kind of open up to me. At least in Steven's case, I always feel like Jeff doesn't require a lot of egging on to talk, but at the same time, there's only so much he'll tell you. He also has a filter that Steven doesn't.
Well, it's funny because, if you compare the book and the film, I think one of the things that I like so much more about the book is you really focus more on the brotherly relationship between the two. And it's an essential part of the entire story and their entire career. I mean, the film addresses it too, but not to the extent that I think you could do in the book, and allowing them to kind of explain, their own perspective, because they both have different views of a lot of this stuff that happened. And you really understand that, each one of these guys is intensely individual, but yet they still very much work, together as this unit, in spite of sabbaticals or those hiatuses or whatever it may be. But that relationship is absolutely essential here.
Absolutely. And when we were doing the book proposal, one of the things that, I touted it as is, like, this is really the first autobiography of a brother band, like where they're both telling their story. Like, we never got one from the Everly Brothers. We'll probably never get one from Oasis. We never got one from the Fogertys and CCR. So I thought this was kind of a unique opportunity. And also, I mean, part of it's just the difference between a book and a documentary. Like, you can tell more in a book. But also watching the documentary, and I understand why Andrew Reich did this in the documentary, like, bring in a lot of other voices, a lot of people who are maybe more famous than Red Cross, to talk about, like, how great Red Cross and how they should have been bigger. But, like, I just wanted them. I just wanted them to tell their story, and I wanted them to, and I interviewed them individually for the entire book, because I didn't want to get them on the phone together, on Zoom together, and Steven start telling a story and Jeff go, like, that's not what happened, or like do the big brother thing where he just kind of steps all over him. And because I knew these guys were very different people and brought very different things to the band. And as I'm fond of saying, like, a band led by two Jeff McDonalds would not have lasted, and a band led by two Stephen McDonalds probably wouldn't have lasted either. I mean, it might have lasted longer and but it wouldn't, there is something about that relationship that really produces the chemical reaction that is the Red Cross music.
It's funny because Steven's career apart from Red Cross is actually pretty diverse and interesting. The Melvins and Off, with with Keith Morris. I mean, just to go back to him for a bit and talk about a long-standing, interesting relationship. But one of the things that I asked Steven about was about the Jellyfish sessions, because I had forgotten that he had been on those sessions until I read your book. I'm like, oh, of course. And I'm a big fan of Jellyfish, but it's interesting that once I started to realize that Jeff was involved in this, I realized, hey, wait a minute. They borrowed a lot from Red Cross, and there's not just musically, but the image and everything else. There's a lot of duplication there.
Yeah, it's funny because I was never a big Jellyfish fan, and I wonder if part of that was because when that first Jellyfish record came out, I had a lot of people come out to me like, "Hey, you like Red Cross? Like, you should check out Jellyfish." It's kind of the same with Red Cross. People saying to them like, "Hey, you like the New York Dolls? You should check out Poison." It's like, yeah, but it's not. That's you're basing this on certain visual signifiers that do not translate. I felt Jellyfish was much more polished and slick than what I was into at the time. I went back and listened to Belly Button while I was writing this book with the McDonald's, and I didn't find it offensive, but it's just not my thing. But it was interesting that Steven played on that record because they were friends of his. He liked what they were doing, and it was only after Third Eye comes out and Belly Button comes out where all of a sudden it's like they're being pitted against each other, by the industry. Who is it? Is it somebody from Gold Mountain says to him like, "Yeah, too bad about that Jellyfish record. Like there is only room for one pair of bell bottoms in this scene, cowboy." And and again, it's like so much of it is just about into the story is just about timing and weird things that are out of their own control. And of course Steven was going to play on his friend's record. Steven loves to play. He's a great musician, and he loves to broaden his musical horizons by playing with other people. But all of a sudden, he realizes that he inadvertently helped, shoot his own band in the foot by, or at least in the eyes of other people by helping Jellyfish.
Yeah, I had mentioned that the two of us are about the same age. I think we both graduated high school in the same year, and
84.
84, exactly. So it's kind of funny, two old guys talking about music and kind of swan diving into this lifetime obsession of music. I mean, obviously, as a journalist, you've gotten into it a little bit in a different direction than I have. But where does this come from for you, and how did you start writing about music as opposed to just being an unprofessional fan?
I actually started writing about music for my high school paper. I was obsessed with Rolling Stone, Cream magazine, Trouser Press. I was always, not always. I didn't really get into music, where I was actually buying records till 1978. But then when I realized that there were all these magazines about music and that I could learn from them, learn more things than I was learning from the radio.
Which is a terrible place to learn shit from.
Yeah, although, in the 70s, it was still
right.
You could, between the AM dial and the FM dial, you could learn a lot. And I did. And I read a lot about that on my Substack, actually, because I'm that was 1978 to 1980 was a real formative period for me, and musically, and so much, it was mainstream for sure. I didn't get into punk rock and new wave until a little after the fact, because with the exception of Blondie and, one or two Elvis Costello songs. I didn't, and one Clash song, I didn't hear that much on the radio, but still, like, it was just like every day you turn on the radio and there would be some song that you hadn't heard before and you wanted to know more. So magazines were how I've learned more. And then I decided, wow, that seems fun. And I was always, very into expressing myself. So I thought, like, yeah, I'll write record reviews for my high school paper. And like, I remember, like, I still have it. Actually, a friend of mine, high school friend of mine, confronted me with this a few years ago. I still have the clipping. It's like my top 10 albums of 1982, and it's so fucking embarrassing. It's like, look back on it, like I bitch about the fact that there was no Southside Johnny record released in 82, and but there's still some good things on it, like Imperial Bedroom by Elvis Costello.
Sure.
So some other things that are, were quite, that I still listen to today. But this is all part of the process. And so, I wrote for my college paper. I wrote for my college radio newsletter. I was a DJ. And then after college, I decided that I wanted to put a band together. This is like the start of the alternative rock revolution, and I sniffed revolution in the air, and I wanted to be part of it. And so I moved back to Chicago, where I'd spent my high school years, and I put a band together with some friends, and we did okay in Chicago. We were briefly hot for about a 6-month period, but then a la Red Cross, we didn't do, we spent too much time not focusing on what we should have been focusing on, and missed our opportunity, our window of opportunity. But while I was doing that, I was working in a record store, and I was, I wasn't the Jack Black, but I was the guy in the record store who would, if you asked his opinion, he would give it to you. I wouldn't make you feel bad about the record that you were looking for reinforcement on, but I would say, you know what, if you like that kind of stuff, there's something better that I think you might like. So I was doing this one day, and a guy who was a semi-regular customer was like, was asking me about some records, and I was just like, maybe try this one instead. And he's like, do you write? And I was like, yeah. What do you mean? He's like, do you write like record reviews? I was like, well, I have in the past. He was like, well, I'm putting together a culture magazine, and I need a music editor, and someone with your knowledge and opinionatedness would be perfect for it. So then I became the music editor of this magazine. It's called Chicago Sub Nation. It lasted like maybe a couple of years, and I found like I liked doing that a lot more than I liked rehearsing in the basement 3 nights a week, and having the same arguments over and over again with my friends, and driving to gigs in a van that kept breaking down. And so it's like I'm really glad, and I've played in bands since, and I'm really, I still make music to this day, but I'm really glad that I had that experience. But I'm also, because I think it really has informed my writing about music, because I know what it's like to do it. And I found that was a far more fulfilling thing in many ways than, because by that time I was like 27, and I just was like, yeah, this is not so romantic anymore. And the other thing too was, and like, this kind of comes up a bit, there's echoed a bit in the Red Cross book, where it's like, at some point, like when you've been making music in a certain scene, and things go well for you for a while, and then all of a sudden other newer bands start getting all the attention. It's hard to be copacetic with that. It's hard to be like, oh yeah, that's just the way this goes. Like you start getting really bitter, and I found myself getting really bitter and really like not liking a lot of new music, because it was stuff that was similar to what I was playing was making me angry that like, well, how come those guys got a record deal and we didn't, that sort of thing. So by removing myself from the game and reinventing myself as a music journalist, I was able to leave all that baggage behind and just appreciate music without the bitterness. And then in '93, I moved to LA, started writing for the LA Reader, which was back when free weeklies were the order of the day in big cities. And that was, and started covering the local scene. But, and that really kind of, has taken me to today. It's like jumping from one publication to another, doing freelance stuff a lot of the time. And it's not a career I would recommend to anybody, but but at the same time, it's been a pretty interesting life.
You had mentioned your Substack earlier, and I've been sifting through it and really enjoying it. And there's a number of things about it that I think is really cool. Is that you're not just focused on one kind of music or another. I mean, you've written stuff not just about Red Cross, but the Kinks and Queen and Body Count and about the death of Chris Christopherson. And I'm reading all this and then. But at the same time, I'm also reading like your most recent one where you talk about Dave Parker and Dick Allen going into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And as I'm reading it, as a lifelong Red Sox fan, I'm getting down to the point where you start mentioning Louis Tiant. I'm like, all right, Dan Epstein's my man. My man over here talking about the El Tiante. But it's great to see that there's a diversity of your interests here, and that baseball is another one, especially baseball in the 1970s. What is it about that decade that seems to connect with you? Is it just because the baseball you watched as a kid, or is it more than that?
I mean, that's where it started. Was like 76 was the year I became like a hardcore baseball fan. And this was before I became a music fan. I mean, baseball was my obsession before I switched over into music. But where that really kind of rekindled was, I would say, in the late 90s, I was going through some stuff in my personal life, and for whatever reason found that reading about baseball was the one thing that could kind of bring my internal temperature down and like recenter me. And so, after reading a bunch of books on like, the Yankees in the 1940s and 50s and Sandy Koufax and all this, I was like, well, you know what? I'd really like to read some books about baseball in the 1970s, only to find that there really weren't any. And that the ones that did sort of touch upon it were much like the Ken Burns baseball documentary, kind of looked at the 70s as this aberration, this strange period where, it was weird, and like the colorful polyester uniforms and, drugs. This is, let's move on to the 80s when things got a lot more cut and dried. And it's like, no, man, that's what made the 70s so compelling and so interesting. And as a kid, I didn't know it was an aberration. That's just the way it was. Like ball players with huge afros and, and guys like Mark Fidrich talking to the baseball and before throwing it. Like, this was what baseball was to me. So I decided that I wanted to write about it. And my first book on that, Big Hair and Plastic Grass, which came out in 2010, was sort of like my love letter to that period and my attempt to kind of recontextualize it and talk about how much pop culture collided with baseball in the 70s in a way that it hadn't in previous decades. And then I read another book called Stars and Strikes, which is specifically about the 76 season, and talking about like the bicentennial celebrations and like how everything was kind of happening against this backdrop of, red, white, and blue.
And those awful White Sox uniforms. Those two.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. With the White Sox shorts. And, so it was funny because as a music journalist, it was very hard for me to get Big Hair and Plastic Grass published, because they're like, publishers were like, well, you're not a baseball writer. Luckily I found an editor and a publisher that was willing to take a chance on it. It was quite successful, which is then ironic because flash forward to 2022, and I'm having my first conversations with Jeff and Stephen McDonald about writing their book, and they go up on Amazon, and the only books by me are baseball books about baseball in the 1970s. They're like, why does this guy want to write a book about Red Cross? And also, I think they were kind of leery that like like, here's this guy who's all about the 70s. Is he going to just be like, yeah, 70s, bell bottoms, disco balls, and Red Cross? And so, because they've run up against a lot of that in the
Sure.
journalistic coverage of them in the past. So I really had to, be like, I've written about, I've been a professional music journalist for 30 years. B, I'm more or less the same age as you guys. My experience of the 70s was pretty similar. Like, I came from a similar, middle class, at times lower middle class background, where like you kind of, I wasn't wearing sequin body stockings to school. I was wearing, snot stained corduroy pants. And so, I think it very quickly we realized we were all on the same page, but it sure looked weird to them at first.
It's so funny because when I was a kid, all of my baseball cards were 1970s baseball cards.
Sure.
70, 73 through I think like around 78, 79, I think is when I finally started to kind of, phase out of them. And it's funny because, here we are talking in a week where Juan Soto signs a $756 million contract. And yet you and I find baseball far more relatable when guys are in the dugout smoking cigarettes and Doc Ellis is dropping acid to pitch a no-hitter. We can relate to that. We can't relate to a Juan Soto.
Right. And at the time, we became baseball fans. Like, a lot of baseball players were working odd jobs in the offseason. The famous story of Richie Hebner of the Pirates working as a gravedigger at his family funeral home in the off season. And it's because like they had to make ends meet. I mean, they did all right. Like, I think your average player was making like $25,000 a year in 1976, which would be like $100,000, $125,000 today. But it's still like, considering that they were on the road 6 to 8 months out of the year and like had to move their families around, it was a tough existence. So on the one hand, like I think and I don't know if this is the rabbit hole you wanted to go down by bringing this up, but like 1976 is the beginning of full scale free agency, which I think in theory is a very good thing. I think players need, I think it's only right that players have self-determination about where they wanted to play and who they wanted to play for, and that, and if they could get a better offer, then like, fine, that's on the teams. And, I've always said, I don't go to a ball game. I never went to a ball game to see the owner, unless it was Bill Veeck, of course.
That's different.
And
that's different.
That is an anomaly right there. So the players are what makes the game interesting. So I go to see them. So if they can receive an equitable cut of the pie, I don't care how big that pie is, if they deserve it. I think Juan Soto, that's a ridiculous amount of money. It's obscene. At the same time, I don't begrudge him for making it. All the people are like, oh yeah, making all this money for playing a kid's game. Yeah, well, no kid is going to play the game at that level. And if MLB is making that kind of money hand over fist, where a team can offer Juan Soto a contract like that, then absolutely. I mean, it speaks more to our our strange priorities as a country than it does some sort of problem with the game.
I want to tell you a quick story. One of my proudest moments, proudest radio moments, and I wish I had the picture here to show you, because I actually have a picture of me doing this. And you want to talk about like old 1970s, free agent style players. I was working at a radio station in Milwaukee, and Raleigh Fingers was our guest in the studio.
Right on.
Right on. And I asked him point blank, can I touch the mustache?
Ooh.
And I did.
Bold.
And I got a chance to touch the mustache. And the picture is me just putting like both hands on the tips of his mustache. So I mean,
on the handlebar.
I almost didn't wash my hands for the next 35 years. But I was like, man, that what a thrill that was.
Yeah, I mean, that would be like asking Oscar Gamble to touch his afro. Though sadly, Oscar is long gone. But and the last decade at least of his life, he was completely bald, which was ironic. But yeah, no, I mean and that's the thing. Like, there's so much character. There's so much interesting personalities going on in those days where it's like, I couldn't pick Juan Soto on the street. I couldn't tell the difference between him and Aaron Judge on the street. It's just like they're just, big dudes, and there's just isn't the kind of color in the game now that there was at the time when when players were eking out a living, and most ballparks were lucky if they could draw 20,000 people to a ball game, and that's the other. I mean, and I don't want to go too far off onto this, but that's another thing. I don't understand how that many people are paying those kind of ticket prices for ball games these days. Like, it's just. Like in 1979, I was living with my mom. We didn't have a lot of money at the time. And we saved up so we could go to a Dodger game. We were living in LA at the time, and so we could have box seats. And I think box seats were like $5 a piece.
Yeah,
and
right.
But for four of us to go, that's $20. That was I was getting maybe $3 a month allowance. So that was some hefty savings was required.
And if you're a Mets fan this week, you need $39,000 and a credit check just to get it onto the bleachers.
Yeah, and that's just I don't get that at all.
Yeah, I don't either.
And so I haven't been to a major league game in years. Partly, no, that's not true. I did go, not this last year. I did go to a couple in 2023. But yeah, but both times I didn't pay for it. So it's.
That's the best kind of baseball to see these days.
Yeah.
I know that I really do appreciate the time you give me today, Dan. I know that you are working. What I understand is you're also working on a music memoir of your own. I don't know where that stands or how far you're in. If that's your next project or what it is.
It's one of my next projects, and I'm kind of teasing chapters from it on my Substack, which the Substack's called Jagged Time Lapse, and it's sort of like each chapter is about a specific song that I heard on the radio in my adolescence. Again, talking 78, maybe 77 to the end of 1980, and just how that mirrored, how a song bringing up Louis Tiant, the one time I saw him pitch in person was at Oakland Coliseum in August 1977, and on a day where I heard Crosby, Stills, and Nash's Just a Song Before I Go for the first time, and I heard it 3 times on the radio that afternoon before going to the game. So these two completely separate things are forever fused in my mind, and so I wrote a chapter about that's up at Jagged Time Lapse, and still doesn't have a name, doesn't have a publisher. I'm not even sure that I'm looking for a publisher. Maybe the sort of thing that I self-publish, because I don't know, we'll see. That when you get in bed with a publisher, there's all kinds of things that kind of spiral out of your own control.
Imagine
as
that.
I'm seeing with the Red Cross book. So it's so we'll see. I would say it's probably 2/3 of the way finished, but that remains to be seen.
Well, when it's ready, let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it again.
Absolutely, Bax.
Yeah.
This was an absolute pleasure, man. Great to meet you, and thank you for having me on.
The name of Dan Epstein's new book is called Now You're One of Us, The Incredible Story of Red Cross. And if you're a fan of music and baseball, check out his Substack, Jagged Time Lapse. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. You can always email me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks again to Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram of Chicopee for their support. And thanks to you for listening to Baxie's Musical Podcast.